So we're going to talk about gluing some boards up to make necks. And what I've got with me right over here on the bench is 3 pieces of mahogany. And you can see the grain on the top piece is concave in this direction. On the bottom piece is in the opposite direction. I like that configuration. You'd love this to be straight grain going across, but that's very unlikely to happen with a board this wide. So you get it as close as you can get it. The middle board can go in either direction. You just want the grain as straight as possible. So once you have that, let's back the camera up and I'll show you how we're going to put this together to make some necks. I'll be right back. Here are the boards. 1 piece. Then on top of that, I'm going to put a piece of walnut veneer. And that's just there for some color. It doesn't really have much else to do. I'm going to stack the next piece and then another piece of walnut veneer. This doesn't have to be walnut. It can be, anything. I just like something that's going to be a contrasting color. So I want to stack these as accurately as I can to this corner over here. And try to get things straight as they go across. And then here comes the last board. And that's it. That's what the next stack looks like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go away for a second, come back with some clamps. And I'm going to clamp these all together. And we're going to drill some holes so we can dowel them up, because we're going to glue these together. And I want dowels in the corner so things don't swim while we're clamping it up and have glue on them. So I'll be right back. We'll show how the clamps are going to go on this guy and we'll go from there. Okay, so here are all the boards. They're stuck together with clamps. I've got 10 clamps on here. And if I get a straight edge and lay it across, that is just as straight as it can be. I see no gaps anywhere. It looks really good. So that's just how we want our boards to come together. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to drill a hole in each corner of the stack and then insert a dowel so they don't move. So once we get glue put on all the surfaces, and we get the dowel stuck in there and start putting clamps on, it won't swim around on us. So I've got a 5/16 inch drill bit. And I'm just going to drill a couple of holes here. There we go. And we'll see if that dowel will go through. It just makes it. I did a little bit of sanding on the dowel just before I turned on the camera, hoping that it would go through there. And I'm going to cut that dowel off a little bit long so I can easily handle it while we've got gluing in there. So let me scoot this over a bit. See if I've got enough battery power left to drill another hole. It's getting a little weak. Nope, so I'm going to turn the camera off and get a new battery. There we go. And that looks good. So now, let's see if we can get the dowel in there this time. And again, it's going through just fine. So I'm going to saw this guy off. And we're ready to go. So I'm going to take this whole thing apart. And once I've got it apart, I'm going to mix up some epoxy. And before I start spreading, I'll turn it back on so you can see the mixing of the epoxy. That's not a complicated thing, but maybe a lot of people haven't done that yet. So I'll be back in just a minute and mix up the glue, and we'll get ready to go. Okay, I'm back. I'm ready to mix up the glue, and here is our station that we're going to do that at. I've got a couple of pipettes here that I'm going to use to draw the glue out of the bottles. I use these long pipettes because when the glue gets down farther and farther, they're the only thing I can really get into that bottle with and get glue, once the level's down a little bit. The ends of the pipettes are a little too small to draw this thick glue into them, so I'm just going to use a pair of scissors and cut those tips off so that it's a little bigger, and that's all that's about. So I've got a little a jeweler's scale here that I've had for many years, and I'll turn it on, put the cup on, and zero it out. And this is just basic general purpose System 3 epoxy. This should be just fine, or it will be just fine for this process. I've used it before. And I'm going to mix up about an ounce of epoxy here. That'll be my first bottle. And so I'm just watching the scale here climb. It's almost at 1. Very close. And this mixing doesn't have to be this exact as I understand it. So there's 1 ounce. Okay, so now I'm going to put in 1/2 ounce of the hardener. So we're just doing the same thing. I'm just going to watch the bottle. Now this is the fast hardener, and there's very little fast about this fast hardener. It'll be getting very tacky and pretty hard after a couple of hours. So we've got plenty of time. If I start mixing this on and find that I run out, it's not going to be a big deal to just mix up a little bit more and keep going. Okay, we're getting pretty close here. And this is a 2-to-1 mixture. So 1 ounce to 0.5 ounces. And then I've just got this piece of paper here that I'll put down, or that I always put down, just to put the pipettes on so I don't get any leaking onto my bench. So I'm going to use that little dowel that I was using before and just mix this up. And it'll take a second to mix. And I've mixed quite a bit here because I'd really like to not run out. But like I said, if I do, it's not a major problem. But we've got several surfaces that we have to put glue on. If I only had the 3 pieces of mahogany, I'd only need to epoxy 2 surfaces. But with the walnut veneers in between, then I have to put glue on. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 surfaces. Okay, that should be pretty good. So I'm going to set that down and move a couple of things out of the way. And I'm going to turn the camera off for a second, get some paper, spread it out here, and I'll be right back so you can see what's going on. So I put paper all over my little bench here, and I've got my first board, and it's down. I've taken my dowels, and I've got them stuck in each corner. Is that showing up on the video? Let me move the camera just slightly so you can see that. There we go. So there are the dowels. And now I'm going to start putting on epoxy. So this is just going to go on kind of thick. I'm just using a foam brush, just something that epoxy is going to ruin it anyway, so I want something cheap to spread it with. Now you can use Tight Bond for this job, and I've done that many times, but I have understood from a lot of other luthiers that epoxy is a really good glue to do a job like this with. Tight Bond tends to just inject a lot of moisture into the wood, and since Tight Bond really hardens from exposure to air, it takes a long time for that glue to dry way down in the middle, and for all the moisture to dry up. Okay, there's the first piece. And epoxy, on the other hand, is a chemical reaction, so it doesn't really need the air to dry out. Okay, so now I'm going to put glue on this surface here, not on the surface of my walnut. And I can see I'm going to be running out before too long. Maybe I'll get through this board. Maybe I won't. I probably won't. But this wood is very dry, soaks up a lot, and I want to be sure to get it on thick enough so that any little voids or anything get filled up. Okay, so I am running out. So I'm going to turn the camera off, mix up another batch, and be back in just a couple of minutes. Okay, I'm back. I've got more glue mixed up here. And I've got just a touch more mixing to do. And like I said, this gives you plenty of work time. So we're not in any risk of things drying out on us. And I had to replace my foam brush also. These are made pretty cheaply, and after they get a little bit of glue in them and they move back and forth a few times, they pretty much want to fall apart. Okay. I think that's pretty good. So we're going to take this board and put it right down on top of this one. There we go. Okay, that's ready to go. Now we've got to do this side of this board. So let's get started on that. So I know this is a long process. Doing it with Tite Bond is certainly faster, but your results with the epoxy are going to be better. Okay, so I can see right after this, I'm going to be out of epoxy. Okay, so let's put this on. Oh, there we go. And there we go. Okay, last surface is there. I've just got a little bit more of this left. I'll go ahead and spread it on. And then I'll have to mix up just a little bit more to finish this off. Okay, so I'm going to turn off the camera again, mix up just a little bit more to finish this off. I'll be right back. So I'm hoping that I'm actually mixing up a little too much. I would rather mix up a little too much than have to mix again. Okay, so that should be pretty good. Now let's see if this brush will let me get through to the end. It's starting to fall apart. Okay. Well, that's definitely getting us through to the end. Okay, that's great. Done. So now let's see if we can get this board down on top of everything. That was the tricky part last time. Okay, that's going in. Oops. Gotta get that out of the way. Okay. There we go. The stick is all the way through. That's terrific. We are down. Okay, so I like to use these F-style clamps to just get it started. They do a really good job of just holding everything down really hard. And that's what we want to do. And the person who said you probably can't have too many clamps was probably right. I'm going to check just how everything's looking. Looks really good, nice and straight. And so I'm just going to fill this thing up with clamps now. Mainly now using the cam clamps. Okay, And I see there's some squeeze out pretty much all the way around. That's looking really good. And I'd give this at least 24 hours in the clamps. Though the glue should be dry before that, but it just should give us a little safety margin. So there's how I put together my necks. I will show later, I'll probably get at least 3 necks out of this arrangement. And I can just draw the profile of the neck on it and cut it out on the bandsaw and then use that neck while I just put the rest over, waiting for the next guitar. So we'll go through all that process as the time comes, and we'll go from there. I'll talk to you later. Okay, we're back. We're going to start working on the neck here. And after gluing that set of boards up in the previous video, I have already cut one neck blank out of it, and I'll show you what's left of the board. You can see it right here. Here is a template. It's just a plexiglass template that I use. This is for a 25.4 inch scale. And this is basically where that template went when this first neck was cut out. So I'm just going to go down here and draw out the next one. And I'll probably get a third one out, which will come right down in this area. So I kind of like to glue up multiple boards like this and get several necks out of it, if I can. So I'm just going to place this and just sketch right around it, just trace right around it. And I'm just using a dark pencil. This is like an HB drafting pencil, and I kind of like these dark pencils for drawing on wood like this, because oftentimes the lighter colored ones just don't show up as well. So there that is, and I'm just going to use a straight stick here to extend this down on either side. Okay, so there's what the basic neck is going to look like. I don't know how well that's showing up on the camera, but that doesn't really matter right now. I'm going to take this over to the bandsaw and cut this out, and then we'll go from there. We'll get started on how to put our neck together, and I'll see you in a few minutes. Okay, so while I was at it, I just cut out both of the remaining necks. So you can see here's one and here's the other. And so now I can just, I've got a little bit of trimming to do on these left, but I can just pick out which one I want, and either one should work just fine. So I'll be back in a few. Okay, so here we are with our neck. The surface where the top of the neck meets the fingerboard was just bandsawn, so that's rough. So I've got it over here at my jointer, and we're going to run this through the jointer a few times. I've got the depth of cut set really, really low, probably as small as I can set it. And we just want to shave a little bit off until it's nice and level, and we'll go from there. So you could probably hear on that second cut, it cut all the way. And if I look at it in the light, there are no gaps. Everything looks nice and flat. So that's what we're going to use as our surface. So the next thing that we have to do is I'm going to go set up at the router table, and we're going to cut the truss rod slot. So that's the next thing. I'll be right back. Okay, so here we are over at the router table. I've got a 1/4 inch bit in my router, and I want to set the depth. And so the truss rods that we use are 3/8 of an inch deep. So I want to set this at just the tiniest little bit deeper than that, maybe less than a 32nd. So let's, oops, the right direction. So this is just a little measuring square that's available at most places. Home Depot or Ace Hardware, that kind of place. And so there is a 32nd. And I'm going to get my flashlight and shine a little bit better light on this so my old eyes can see it. Okay, so that's 3/8 plus a 32nd. I'm going to go down just a little bit more. So that's about halfway between 3/8 and 3/8 plus a 32nd. So that's about a 64th of an inch. So that's pretty good. So I'm going to lock it in at that depth. And now we need to set up the fence, because it's important that we get this cut right down the middle of the neck, at least as close as we can get it to the dead center. So I'm going to grab a ruler real quick. Now I want to make a mark right here on the end, because I'm going to be running it through this way, and I want to see exactly where that bit is going to hit the end. So I've got a standard StewMac centering ruler. So I want this to go dead center, which actually also happens to be the center between our two pieces of walnut, our two little walnut veneers there. And so if we just set it up and center it between those two veneers, that's going to be very good. So there's the center, and there's 1/8 of an inch on each side. So there are the 3 marks. One is in the middle and one is 1/8 of an inch on each side. So now I'm going to bring it over to my fence and see if I can get that bit right in between those two lines that I have on the outside. And there is awfully close. Now it could be that this is off by the tiniest little bit, and that's okay. I've seen some truss rod slots cut that are pretty far off. This is not going to be very far off at all, if it's off at all. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to attach the vacuum, make some noise here for a second, and I'm just going to touch the end, and we'll see where it is. And if it needs to be adjusted slightly, we'll adjust it. So I'll be back in just a minute. Okay, so I have made just a touch, and you can see here that that looks like it's pretty darn close to the dead center between my two lines. So like I said, if I'm off by a little, it's not by enough to matter. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this slot, and I'll be back in just a minute. That looks pretty good. Okay, so we're back over at the jointer now. I'm going to use this little jig here that I copied from Tom Rebecki. And this is made to put the little pieces of wood here into the truss rod slot. And I'm going to run it through the jointer and get my angle set just right. And it's going to do two things. It's going to set this angle just where I want it at about 15 degrees. But the other thing is this is still bandsawn, so it's very rough. So I'm going to smooth that out at the same time, and we'll kill two birds with one stone. So the way that this is going to happen is I'm just going to put it right through the jointer. This jointer does have a helical head, so it's got these multiple small blades that are going to cut. And we're running this through the opposite way of how you'd like to run it through, because the grain is all going this way. But this cutting head really helps keep it from tearing out. And so it really cuts very smoothly and does a great job at that. So I'm going to go ahead and make this cut. And what we're going to do is we're going to put it through, and it's going to hit the end. And then I'm going to have to change the depth and cut a little deeper and a little deeper and a little deeper. And eventually we'll be able to go all the way across, and then our headstock will be ready. Okay, that last cut got it all the way. So that's nice and smooth. The angle's just right. We've still got plenty of thickness here, and we're ready to move on. Okay, so here are 2 carbon fiber rods. Now, I buy these from a company called Dragon Plate, and I buy them in 4-foot lengths. And so I just use a hacksaw and cut them down, and they're going to go about 3/16 of an inch away from the center line on each side of my truss rod slot. And this cut is a little tricky because the dimensions of this rod are 1/4 inch deep, 0.225 deep, but 0.2 wide. Well, I don't know of a place that sells a cutter for something like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut these with a 3/16 inch bit, which is like 0.187, which is too small. And then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to tap one end of my fence to make it a little wider cut and cut the slot. And once it fits, then it'll go in and we'll cut the other side. So that's what we're going to be doing. And I'll let you watch this fascinating process while I do it, just in case you have any questions. But that's what's going on. So I'm going to change the bit and measure it out, and we'll be ready to cut in a few minutes. I put in the new bit, and I've set it for a depth of 1/4 inch plus about a 64th. I want to bury these in the slot, and we're going to epoxy them in, so we'll have a little coat of epoxy over the top of them. The other thing is I've made a measurement here, and maybe you can see it just off to the side. And that's where I'm going to make my slot. And then I'm going to turn it around. I don't have to measure both sides. I'm going to turn around and cut it the other way. So that'll cut it the same distance on the other side. So I've only got to measure it once. These slots are still way too small. These rods are nowhere near ready to drop in. So I'm going to take one end of my fence, this end over here, cut a little bit wider, just a little bit, and run it through again. Okay, so the next jig that I'm going to show you is a jig that I like to use, but it is unnecessary. You don't have to have this. I didn't make this until I built quite a few guitars. And basically, all it is I put the neck into this jig and clamp it in, and I'll use a router bit to go around the edge, and it just thins the neck down so that I have less to carve later. Like I said, it is not necessary. So if you don't have the ability to make a tool like this or a jig like this, it is not a critical thing to have, but I like it. I use it on every guitar, so I'll just show it to you here. And it's just basically a jig that the bearing rides along this edge here, and that edge is shaped exactly how I want my neck to be shaped. I use this little volute, and this is for a 25.4-inch scale, 14 frets to the body, and it's not a cutaway. So what I've done up to now, since last time we had a video here, I put the neck into the jig and I traced all the way around here, and then I just went over to the bandsaw and I trimmed it close to that line, so I have less to cut off. So all I'm going to do now is I'm just going to clamp the neck to my jig. Just get it in there nice and stable. And this bit that I'm using here, it is a huge bit. It's 2.5 inches tall. I find it to be a bit frightening to use this jig. It's just enormous. So I use it because it does the trick, but it is a bit intimidating. So I will try to get my vacuum as close as I could really get it here, and make sure that everything is clamped well into position, and we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, I need to go through something that's important here, and it's about the direction of your router bit and the grain of your wood. This is really a critical thing. We've talked about this before, but I want to talk about it again because I'm going to do something a little different than I've done on past cuts. So let's take a look at it. We've got our neck here, And then here's the headstock. Now the grain is all going in this direction. So the bit is going in this direction. So the last thing I want to do is have the bit coming in this direction and splitting that headstock open. Because that will happen if I just start taking the router up in this direction. It will cause that to split. So I don't want to go in this direction because that's a climb cut. And this is a huge surface area that bit can get caught on and slam the board into me or something else. So you don't want to go in either direction here. So what are we going to do? Well, I call this a nibble cut. And so let me explain what I'm talking about. I'm going to start up at this end up here. And I'm going to nibble in maybe 1/4 of an inch. And then another 1/4 inch, and another 1/4 inch, and another 1/4 inch, and another 1/4 inch, and go all the way in that direction. So it's going to take longer to do this cut, but it's going to be a very smooth cut. This is the safest way to do a cut like this because you're not grabbing very much material. It can't really, whereas a climb cut, you've got a lot of material it can catch, or if you're going in this direction, it can catch a lot of material. But if I'm coming back and I'm just biting in maybe 1/4 of an inch, it's not going to create a dangerous situation, and it's going to make the cut just fine. So that's what I'm going to do here. And so pay attention if you decide to try to do something like this. You got to be aware of what direction your bit's going and what direction your grain's going, because it's a good way to ruin your neck if you're not aware of it. So I'll be right back. I'm going to go sit back up at the router. Okay, so here we are. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to move my whole jig down here so I just hit the very edge. And then I'll go in another 1/4 inch and another 1/4 inch and another 1/4 inch. And this is going to work really well. And when I come up here to do this volute, where it's a really dangerous situation as far as the grain and the direction of the grain, or the bit and the direction of the grain, it should cut it all just fine. So I'm going to put my earphones back on, turn the vacuum back on, and get this done. Okay, so I don't know if this came out visible on the video, but you can see a little spot right here where I did get a little tear out. There's some times that just can't be avoided. But I think this is going to be okay, because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be carving this into an arc here. And I believe that the arc that we carve is going to miss this chip out here, or we're just going to be sure that it does. So anyway, sometimes that happens and you just can't always avoid it. So we'll do the best we can to work around that, and it'll end up being okay. Okay, well, now that our neck is in pretty good shape, the next thing that we're going to work on, we're just going to stop for now on that, and we're going to go work on the fingerboard, and we're going to get our fingerboard slotted. So what I've done, I'll move the camera here, is I've picked out a piece of ebony, a nice ebony blank for a fingerboard right here. I jointed one edge to get it nice and flat, and I've just used some double-sided tape to stick it to this template. Now, this template, or this system, is pretty old, so I'm not going to go into detail about it, because anything that you would get now would be quite different. And if you're just starting out, it may be best to just get one of the hand systems instead of using one with a table saw like I've got. So anyway, like I said, I'm not going to go into detail over this. I'm going to turn the camera off. I'm going to put the slots in the fingerboard. And and then if you decide to get yourself a fingerboard slotting system, then you can get something that's up to date. But if you're not planning on building a lot of guitars, it doesn't necessarily make sense to do this step yourself. You can easily buy slotted fingerboards, and in fact, they'll even radius the fingerboards for you. So a few steps here that I'm going to show you how I do, you don't necessarily have to go through that trouble. Anyway, I'm going to slot the board, and I'll be back in a few minutes. Okay, we're back. Since last time, you can see I cut the slots in the fingerboard, and that all looks really nice. I've numbered what slots represent each fret, and on the back I have drawn a center line. Now the center line is not exactly like you'd expect. Remember, I jointed one edge of this fingerboard nice and square, and all of the frets are cut perpendicular to that line. So the center line on my fingerboard is drawn parallel to that good straight line. It's not just a center line from measuring on one end or the other. It's parallel to that edge. So what I'm going to be doing now is cutting a taper into the board. Most steel string fingerboards are tapered from the nut up to the end of the fingerboard. And I use a kind of a typical Martin style taper. And this is a newer template that I made a few years ago. What I used to use is just a piece of plexiglass like this with a couple of pieces of wood as handles on each end. You can see a center line etched in there. You might not be able to see it on the video, but it's on there. So you can just line it up, use double-sided tape, and cut the proper taper into the board. But that's the same thing I've got here. This just uses a vacuum to do the job. But before I make that taper, I'm just going to line it up with the center line and just draw the edge of my template. And I'm going to use a bandsaw and cut that off so that I'm not having to joint away quite so much material. So I'm going to go cut this off on the bandsaw, and I'll be back in a few minutes. Okay, so I've cut the sides of this fingerboard down to where they're pretty close to my lines. And one thing that we need to do before we go and joint these edges down or route these edges down really clean is the end down here, which I've got cut at the 22nd fret. We want that end to be really clean. If you're going to miter this piece of wood that's going to go over the outer edge there, you need to get this joint just perfectly clean. So I've brought it over to my disc sander, and I'm going to move this piece of wood out of the way, and I'm just going to just kiss this back where that edge is really nice, and this will just take a second. So there we go. That edge is really good now, and we can miter it without any problem. So now we'll go over to the jointer, and or not to the jointer, to the router table, and get these two edges cleaned up. I'll be right back. Okay, so I've got the fingerboard now over at the router table. You can see it there. I've put my taper jig onto it, and I've got the center line matching up really well. Now, as I do this, when I go from the wide end down here down to the narrow end, I'm just going to run the jointer straight through. When I turn it around and go from narrow to wide, I'm going to use my nibble cuts the way that we did on that last cut on the neck. That looks really good, and we're ready to start gluing up our binding and purfling on the fingerboard. I'll be right back. Okay, so I found the materials I want to use for the binding and the purfling of the fingerboard, and I'll show them to you here. Right there. So here's a nice piece of Macassar ebony, which I used for the binding, and I'm just going to go to the bandsaw and slice a couple more pieces off of this to use for the fingerboard. And then for the purfling, I just found a little piece of maple veneer, which is plenty long enough compared to the fingerboard here. So I'm going to cut a piece of 1/4 inch wide pieces off of this. So I'm just going to go do that. I'm just going to lay it down on a cutting board and use an X-Acto knife on a straight edge and cut those pieces off. So when I've cut these pieces, I'll be back and we'll get to the job of gluing them up. So I'll see you in a little bit. Okay, I decided to show you how I cut this veneer off, these veneer strips. They can be a little bit tricky. So what I've done is I've just taken a piece of maple here and I've made a mark on each end 1/4 inch from the edge. And I've got my straight edge here and I'm putting it up against those two little marks you probably can't see on the camera. But then I've got a couple of F-clamps. And I want to clamp this down to my tabletop because trying to hold this down by hand and cut, it will often move on you. And once it moves, your cut is ruined. So do it like this. It takes a little more time, but then you get better results. So once that's clamped down, you can just use the X-Acto knife. Now I don't try to cut all the way through it at once. I'll make several cuts. And there, it just popped off. So that's how it is. That's how it's done. So I'm just going to do that one more time. And then I'll cut these two pieces of binding off and I'll be back. Okay, so after running this through the jointer, I'm taking off as little as I possibly can in the jointer. Let's measure this, and it is about 1/64 too big. So it's, yeah, 1/64 over 1 3/4. So I'm not going to try to run this through the jointer again. What I am going to do, I'm going to take these bindings, and they're 85 thousandths now. I can take a few thousandths off of each one of these and get it down to where it's just right, and these will still be plenty wide enough. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to go run these through the sander and come back and we'll see where it is. So I'll be back in a minute. Okay, so I just got these out of the thickness sander and I put them through one time, and now it is within a few thousandths of 1 3/4. So it's just about right. Okay, so we're ready to glue up these purflings. And I've got a jig I usually do this with, but rather than go through that jig, I'm going to show you how to do it without a jig. And if you want to see the jig, it's in my book, so you can look at that. But basically, all I'm going to use here is just a board, a piece of wood that's nice and straight on one side. So you want to be sure that it is straight and check it against the fingerboard. That's nice and straight. And I've got a little piece of wax paper that I've just folded. And it will go right up against that board. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to, let's see, I'm going to put my fingerboard here. And I'm going to use a couple of like 6-inch cam clamps and just clamp this board down really nice and hard to my bench on each side. So that's nice and solid. It's not going anywhere. Then I'm going to put some of these smaller cam clamps about 1/4 inch away from the fingerboard. And I'm going to use 3 of those just to be sure I've got pretty good clamping pressure. And one more. Then I've got a little baggie here full of little wedges. And so we're just going to put these wedges in here and wedge that fingerboard up very tightly against this board, and that'll give clamping pressure against our little piece of purfling that's going in there. So I'm going to pull this out here for a minute. And here's our piece of purfling. And let me grab the glue. Okay, so this is just our regular bottle of Titebond here. And I'm just going to put a little bead down one side. And if you're wondering, will this glue go into my fret slots? The answer is yes. So after we glue on the purfling, we're going to pull out a little tool that you can get at Stuart McDonald and clean out the fret slots. Okay, so I've got that on there, so now I'm just going to slide this in. Be sure that my wax paper is in the right position here. And it seems to be. And a screwdriver is a very helpful thing to have for something like this, because I'm going to go along and push this purfling down with a screwdriver after I get it wedged in there. So let's just put the wedges in one at a time. There's one. And there's two. And there's three. And that seems to be wedged in there very nicely. So I'm actually going to pull those out for a second. And just be extra sure that my piece of purfling is pushed down all the way to the bottom. And that looks good. So now we'll put the wedges back in. And there. So that's it. It's done. So we're just going to leave that for 20 minutes or so, and then I'll come back and do the other side. One reason I like the jig is it'll let me do both sides at once, but that's okay. Not everybody's going to have that, and this is a way to do it. And this is a tool from Stuart McDonald. Now, this is an old one. I think the newer ones have a different handle on them, but it's just got that claw on the end, so you can just go right in there, and I'll show you here. And push that glue right out of the slot. Now I've got a couple down here on the end that I can't get to very well yet, so I'm going to move my clamp so I can get down here. That's good. Okay. And I'll just finish going all the way up and down the line with this, and I'll be back in a few minutes. Okay, so I've got the other piece of binding glued on to the fingerboard here. And so here it is, both sides done, looking pretty good. And so the next thing I want to do is I need to cut a slot in the purfling. I think I said binding earlier. This is the purfling. And the reason for that is just in case the tang of the fret wants to go a little bit longer, it won't push out your binding. This is particularly used in guitars that have multiple layers of purfling outside the fingerboard, between the fingerboard and the binding. In this case, we only have one, so it's probably not quite so critical, but I do it anyway just in case. So what I've got here is a saw, and the cut width, or the kerf on this saw, is 15 thousandths. The kerf on my fret slots down here is about 22 thousandths. And I don't like to use a saw that's the same as the fret kerf, because that's just going to widen out my fret slot a little bit down there at the ends. And the ends is really where you want it nice and tight. That way the frets don't tend to pop up out on the ends. So I'm going to use this slightly narrower saw, and hopefully that this can be seen well enough. And the way I'll do this is I'll use the very heel of the saw blade and get it going back and forth through the slot, and then just tilt my saw forward. And just do the same thing on the next fret and just tilt the saw forward. This way I stress that fret slot the least. And so I'll hold this up here so you can see those slots that have been cut. And this one's not quite deep enough yet, but that's okay. Pretty easy to fix. And just tilt it forward. And that's all there is to it. And I'm just going to go all the way down this side and come all the way up the other side so that it's all done all the way across. And then I'm going to glue on the binding. So I've got two nice pieces of Macassar ebony binding, and we've already measured them for thickness and everything. And so once I get that all done, we'll have our fingerboard bound up and ready to go. So I will take care of those couple of steps, and I'll be back in just a little bit. Okay, so we're back. I've got the bindings all glued onto the fingerboard now. They are looking just fine. And what I'm going to do right now, it's kind of a two-step process. I'm particularly going to focus down here on the nut end. You can see my bindings are sticking up a bit. Let me grab a nipper. And I'm going to cut these off just a little bit. Let me rearrange my saw angle here. So I'm going to just cut these back just a little bit. Yeah, there we go. And cut the other one back. I don't want to cut it too short because I'm actually going to take this end and I'm going to put it through the disc sander. And I want to get that end just perfectly flush with my nut line. This last little fret slot that we cut is the nut. So I want to get this trimmed all the way up to where it meets the fingerboard. And so I'm going to do that right now. So here we go. Okay, so I'm going to take a quick look at it. Looks pretty good. You can still see the step there, so it's not quite ready to go yet. So we're just going to keep going. So there we go. We've got nice sand marks all the way, well, almost all the way across. I didn't quite get everything, but we'll go back and just touch it one more time. Almost. There we go. That's got it all the way across now. So the next thing I'm going to do is my purfling lines are sticking up just a little bit. And then we want to come down here and miter a piece of Macassar ebony and maple on the end, just the end cap for our fingerboard. And we're going to go do that next. So in the meantime, I've had a piece of Macassar ebony scrap left over from doing the bindings with a little piece of maple, and I've had them gluing together. So I'll go over to a different station. We're going to file some of this high material back a little bit. That's our purflings, so that everything is as close to the final levels it's going to be when we do our mitering. So I'll be back in just a couple minutes and we'll get that done. Okay, so here we are with our fingerboard over on my other bench, and I'm just going to use a little plane set with a very, very small cut and trim back this purfling. I don't want to scratch up my fingerboard, but I want that purfling to be as low as I can get it. And we'll do this on both sides. And that's getting pretty close. See, these little shavings are pretty small. So I think that's about right. Next thing we're going to do is just what we did on the other video. We're going to trim these back. You don't want to trim these too short, though. We're going to cut our miter into this side, and we need to leave enough material for us to have our miter. Okay, so now I'm going to put a cutting board under this. We want to cut a 45-degree angle onto these edges here. And the way that you do that is you have to see the reflection of the light. And when the reflection is going the direction that you want your purfling edge to go, that's the way you want to cut. So now we need to make very small cuts, about like that. If you try to cut too big a cut, it's going to tend to crumble or separate your wood. So you want just a shaving. And I'm hoping that that reflection is able to come through on the video, because it's critical that you get that angle just right. And so what we're headed for, I don't know if you can see just how close I am here from the purfling edge to the edge of my fingerboard, but it's probably still between a 32nd and a 16th of an inch away. So we're not close enough yet. We've got to get that edge all the way back to this edge before our miter will work. So this is a difficult little thing to do, but you have to just do it. Now let's take a look at how close I am with that cut. It's getting pretty close, but it's not quite there yet. That is just about there. Okay, so let's go work on the other side here. Now, I kind of need to turn this around, and unfortunately from this angle, you can't see the reflection. But I'm just looking at that reflection in the back edge of my chisel. I'm trying to just slowly bring it back to where it's pretty much even with the end of my fingerboard. And that's getting really close there too. Here is that piece that I told you about. I just glued up a piece of the scrap binding along with a little piece of maple. So now we have to go miter a cut that's going to go in there. And I'm going to do this differently. I'm going to go over to the disc sander again, and I'm going to get that angle put on the disc sander. I've got my piece. I just nipped an edge of that off, and I'm just going to come in here at what appears to be about a 45-degree angle. Unfortunately, I don't have anything to go but my eyeball here. And there's what that looks like. I'll get it closer to the camera so you can see it. And we'll take it back over and see how it fits our mitered edge. But the other edge is awfully close. It's looking quite good. So it's too long. So now I've got to just slowly bring this back. I'll just go back and forth between here and the disc sander numerous times trying to get that to where they both fit just about right. So I will do that and I'll be back in a few. Okay, so our little piece there, our little end graft on the fingerboard is done and it's fitting very well. So I've got a little fixture set up here. And what I've done is I've just got a little piece of scrap wood laid down as a fence, and underneath it I've got a piece of wax paper. And I've also clamped the fingerboard itself to the bench, and we're going to do this just in the kind of standard old way. We're going to put some glue on the piece there, and then we're going to use wedges to clamp it up. So I'm just going to get a little bit of glue on our piece at the ends. Now I'm going to put that in there, try to get it up against the edges. And then I'm going to slide in one wedge from this side and another wedge from this side. And that seems to be in there very well. But that's what it looks like. So it's all set up, all clamped in, all glued. Our bevels look pretty reasonable. We'll let that sit for a while. And then the next step is going to be to go and put a radius on our fingerboard. And we'll take care of that after a little bit. Okay, so I've taken the fingerboard out of the little setup that we had it in. Our miters look pretty good. And we are ready to try to get the radius sanded onto the fingerboard. There's one thing we need to do first, however. The back of the fingerboard is not level, not yet. And so that's what we need to get perfect. If we were to try to glue this down to a fingerboard blank or to a neck blank, it just wouldn't glue very well because it's not a good level surface. So I'm just going to turn on the belt sander here. And this is a nice large, I think it's an 80-inch sanding belt. And I use it a lot. So we're just going to put this down on the sander and try to sand this surface flat. And when it's ready, we'll stop. So I'll let you watch that process. Closer. Okay, so I've got my fingerboard double stick taped to this jig here. Now, I don't want anybody thinking that this is the only way that you can radius your fingerboard. I came up with this idea several years ago. My old business partner and I put together this jig. It works really well, but it's a lot of work to put this together. If you're only making a guitar or two, something like this doesn't really make sense. So there's other ways to do it. And one way certainly would be to use something like one of these radius beams that you can get from StuMac or other places and sand it until it's down. You can use Bill Cumpiano's method from his book, which is using a hand plane, or a combination of those two methods. Or you can make life really simple and just buy your fingerboards pre-radiused and pre-slotted for that matter. So there's a lot of easier ways to do this. If you're just new to this, don't go to all the trouble of making these jigs. But if you've decided this is something you really want to get into, yeah, spending a little bit of time making stuff like this can help you out in the long run. So anyway, basically, this is just a beam here out of maple. I've got a center line on my fingerboard and put double stick tape on it, so it's nice and solid on the board there. Then it goes onto this little cradle that sits on my sander, and it just rocks back and forth on the cradle. And that's all there is to it. So these little rockers, this downside here is 16 inches. If I want a 16-inch radius, I can do a 20-inch radius. And I've got a couple of other boards, so I can do a 14 or a 20, or sorry, 14 or a 10 and a 12. So there's a lot of different radii that can be made pretty easily. So anyway, I'm going to turn on the equipment. I'll show you how this works, and we'll go from there. Starting to get a radius on this side a little bit. You might be able to see it in the camera. I'm going to have to lower the jig just a bit to finish up. So I'll do that and be right back. Hopefully you can see there that there's a little bit of a radius, a 16-inch radius on that side. And on this side, both of them are looking pretty good. And the scratch marks down the fingerboard are pretty even, so I think I've sanded the whole surface pretty well. So basically we're done. And I will go take that off and be back in a couple of minutes. So I want to show you how I get the fingerboard off of the maple beam, because the last thing that you want to do is break this fingerboard, and it's got all these fret slots in it, so it's pretty weak. But you can get an artist's palette, which I use a lot for doing this kind of thing, and just slide it underneath the board. And you don't want to just grab one end and pull up, because that will break your board. So just be very gentle with it and let the knife do most of the work, and then you're done. Now you've got to pull this tape off, and you also want to be gentle with that. You can get an edge to start to lift a little bit here. Then you can start removing. Now don't just pull it up. Hold the board down and keep the board as level as possible while you pull this tape off. And that's a good safe way of getting the tape off the board. This would be a heartbreaker of a time to break a board that you've put this much effort into. So I just wanted to show you what a good safe method is to do it. So anyway, I'll get the rest of this cleaned up and we'll have it done. Okay, so here's our fingerboard on our neck. Now what I've done is I've drawn a little line here, a little line right there at the break angle on the fingerboard, and that's the front edge of our nut right there. There's some guitars that have the nut sitting on the flat part of the fingerboard side, and there's some guitars that have the nut sitting on the neck side, or on the head block side. That's what we're doing, is we're having the nut sit back on the headstock side. So I'm just putting the fingerboard right where it goes, and I'm going to come up here and mark on the side of my neck, both sides, right where the 15th fret is. So you can see I've got the frets numbered 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 12, 15. So we're just marking that, and I'm going to put a little square here and just bring that line across, because the 15th fret is an important thing for us. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to the bandsaw and I'm going to cut a line. I'm going to make a cut right at the end of this neck block here at the 15th fret, because the end of the 15th fret is the end of our dovetail. We're going to then cut back to the 14th fret while we cut our dovetail, but all that will happen in a few minutes. The next thing we do is we cut this off. I'm going to set the miter gauge at 1.5 degrees, and we're just going to cut a little 1.5 degree right there at the 15th fret. Okay, so you might have some difficulty seeing this, but I've got the miter gauge set up at a 1.5 degree angle. And as I put the neck on, let me show you one other thing here. I've got this board at the front edge of my miter gauge, and the board comes right to the edge of the bandsaw blade. So I know that if I put my fingerboard on here, and I have my line that I just drew right on that edge, it'll make a good cut right across where I want it to, and we're going to make that cut right at the end of the 15th fret. So we turn on the vacuum, and we'll just make this cut real quick. Okay, so we're getting set up to do the dovetail in the body first. So there's the guitar sitting in my little pair of vices that holds it nice and sturdy. So you can see it's in there very solid. And the jig I'm going to use is different than the one that I used in my book, for those of you that have seen that. This is a jig, I think it's relatively new, from a company called Elevate. And it's a dovetail jig, and it just fits right over where you want the dovetail to be. This little hole right here lets you look in and get your center line centered just right with the jig. And so there it is. I'm going to put a couple of cam clamps on, and on the back you need to be aware how wide our head block is, because you definitely want these to be clamped onto the headstock, or onto the head block, and not onto the back of the guitar. That would be bad. So we're going to clamp this down nice and solid against the guitar. So there we are. And so we're going to put our router with the dovetail bit in there. And now, just a little reminder, the dovetail in the body is going to cut 3/4 of an inch deep. So we're going to set the cut. For those of you that have used a plunge router, this is a fairly straightforward step. So we just bottom the bit out on the surface of the guitar. We get the screw here bottomed out, and then we just lift the screw. There's a little dial here, and we just get our dial cranked up to 3/4 of an inch. So there's a half right there. There's 5/8, and there is 3/4 of an inch. So then if we move the guitar off of the jig, we can plunge it down the full depth. The bearing rides very nicely on the jig, and we can go ahead and get started. Okay, there we have it. So let's take a look. Take off the clamps. And there we have beautiful dovetail cut. So this is adjustable. If I have a deeper body guitar, I can make it go deeper or shallower. So this is just about right for this guitar. And now we'll go and change it. We'll move the little stabilizer here over to the other side, and this is there to do the neck side. So we'll go do the neck next. Okay, so we're ready to do the dovetail in the neck. I've got our neck set up right here. I've just put this little cloth around it while it's clamped so nothing gets damaged by the clamps. Then here's our little jig. I've just switched this section from the body dovetail over to the neck side. And this is going to be put right over the neck there. And I want to center it as closely as I can in the neck. Now that little hole back here is set for you to center it right exactly in the truss rod slot. However, if our truss rod slot may not have been in the perfect center, then we can always just use a little ruler here. And this is almost exactly 3/8 on this side and almost exactly 3/8 on that side. It looks like our two little walnut lines are hitting the jig at about the same place. So that's the center. So again, I'm going to clamp this thing down. Put my two clamps on there. So they've got to be on there nice and solid. And it looks like we're ready to go. Let me check that again. Looks about right. And that looks about right. So let's do it. I'll get on. Now this time, remember, we're cutting this depth at 5/8, not 3/4. So this is the shorter of the two dovetails. So let's put on our router here. Let's plunge it down to the level of the guitar neck. And now let's zero this back out and crank it up to 5/8. There's a half, and there is 5/8. Okay, so we're set. So let me put on my earmuffs again, and we'll let her rip. Okay, so every time I go around, I'm going to turn the router off, put it back on this side. So I'm always going in the proper direction of the cut. I don't want to try to do a climb cut coming backwards. So we'll just turn it off, reset it on this side, and go back again. So one more time around. Okay, there it is. My neck block was just a little too long, so I've got this little piece that we'll just bandsaw off there on the end, but that doesn't hurt anything. There we have our dovetail. So I'm going to go cut this little guy off real quick. I'll be right back and we'll see how it fits on the guitar. Here's the neck with the dovetail on it. I cut off that little lip that was down below. Here's the body dovetail. That fits in there. Now it goes in slightly low. We're going to use that to our advantage later, so don't worry about it. What I did do is I prepared a couple of shims. And if you notice, these shims are 5/8 wide. The direction of the grain is sideways. That's important. So we'll have to deal with that later, but you do not want your grain to be vertical on this. It's much easier if you've got to shave a little bit of this down to get your neck to fit for the grain to be in this direction. So anyway, I'm just going to stick these in a slot. And now you can see that that neck fits in there just about right. It's pretty level across the top. And here's the important thing that I want you to see. There's a gap up here, about 1/8 of an inch gap between the neck dovetail and the body dovetail. That's important. I've seen books that say that you don't want any gaps like this. That's crap. You want that gap, and here's why. If you ever have to take the neck off of a guitar, the way that's done is you take out the 15th fret, and it just so happens that the 15th fret is 5/8 of an inch from the 14th fret. That's assuming that your scale is either 24.9 or 25.4. It's both very, very close to the same. So you're going to take out that 15th fret, and you're going to drill a couple of holes through the fret slot and inject steam. The steam will go into that gap, and it'll go down and permeate the whole joint, and will let you release that glue and take out your dovetail. You've got to have that gap. If you don't, it's miserable. Also, if you have to tip the neck at all, and you've got that dovetail sitting right against the end of the dovetail cut in the head block, then you got to shave the neck dovetail anytime you have to tip the neck. Keep the gap in there. You'll be glad you did. And anybody who's ever got to work on your guitar will be glad you did. So anyway, I wanted to explain that. Next thing that we're going to do is go and shape our heel. So I'm going to turn off the camera and get ready for that and be back in just a little bit. Before we go start carving on this neck, here is the template that we're going to use. Now, we had this template made quite a while ago. We drew it up, and then we had somebody go and laser carve it on a piece of plexiglass. So anyway, all we're going to do is we're just going to set this on here where it looks like it's pretty centered and comes down to about the bottom of the heel. And that is pretty good right there. So all I want to do is take a pencil and just draw that on each side. And that might be a little light to see, but I can see it well enough here in the light. I've got both sides. And we can go over to our sander now, and we're just going to grind this off basically using our sander and get it down to where it starts to look like a nice Spanish heel on a guitar. So let's go get the sander going and we'll be right back. This is my belt sander, and we're just going to be using this edge of the sander here and hold the neck up to it, just like this, to carve these spots off of the cheeks of the heel. I'm going to put on my dust mask and get the vacuum going. So I'm going to be making a lot of noise, and we'll get it done. Okay, so there it is. It doesn't really take very long, and it's mostly carved and ready to go. We obviously have a lot of shaping to do on this thing to turn it into a nice looking little Spanish heel, but the rest of it's going to be done with some files and that kind of thing, and so the rest will be done by hand. So anyway, that's it. Okay, so now that we've got the heel kind of shaped, and I drew some pencil lines just inside the edge here, which are going to outline some shoulders. And what I want to do is I want to carve away a lot of this material on the front edge here and just leave these outer shoulders. And the reason for that is you don't want this full flat piece here trying to go up against the back of the butt of the guitar or the head of the guitar, because it's curved and this is flat, so it's not ever going to fit quite right. So we're going to carve away everything but just these last little outside bits so that it can fit nice and snug up against the head area of the guitar. Just put a little piece of cloth around it just to protect it. Just put it in here like this. And I've got a 1/4-inch chisel here, and I'm just going to start with it. And I'm just going to start coming in here right about at that pencil line that I made, and I'm just going to cut a little groove all the way up. I hope that's coming through okay. And part of the dovetail here is going to be in the way, so I might have to cut this other edge out from the other side, but that's okay. Now I want to cut all of this material out here and just leave that outside little shoulder out there sticking up. And people always ask me, how far down do you have to cut? You really just need to cut maybe a 32nd. It's just got to be far enough so that none of the area in the middle here hits the sides of the guitar. You just want these edges hitting. Now I did a quick little fit of this neck, and it fits just almost perfect. So we're not going to have to do too much adjusting of neck angles or anything like that, because everything is just about right. So anyway, you want a nice sharp chisel because you're cutting in grain here. And I don't really care if I mess up way down here, because we're going to be putting a heel cap over this area here and covering up any messy edges that I might happen to make. So I'm just doing a little portion of this so you can just kind of see what's going on. And I want to do this all the way up. Now let me turn this around. So now I'm just going to continue working on this same side from the other side. And I'm just trying to follow that pencil line that I made. And my edge is just to keep me from moving too far over into this shoulder. I don't want to mess that up. Now all of this area that I'm cutting away, it doesn't have to be all neat and clean. It just needs to be down from that surface up level a little bit. Okay, so you get an idea of what I'm doing. I'm going to turn off the camera. I'm going to keep working on this, and I'll come back in a few minutes after I've got it done. You can take a look at what's been going on. Okay, so here is the dovetail area of the neck, and you can see I've carved out both sides and down here on the end of the heel as well. So all that should be hitting the guitar are these shoulders here. So let's go take it over and fit the neck onto the guitar body and see how things look, because it's time to kind of get an initial idea of how this neck is going to fit. And the neck goes on here just like this. So far that's looking quite good. So I've got a little jig here. This is just a piece of plexiglass with some lines etched onto it. I've got a center line, and I've got lines on each end that kind of show where the outer strings would go. So I'm just going to lay this down on the neck here. So there is the plexiglass piece right there on the neck. And I don't know if you can see the center line going right down the middle of the truss rod cut. On the body, I can see that it goes right down the middle of the seam. I've got a little line drawn there where the seam is, and it's going right down the middle. So our left to right is looking just virtually perfect. So what I'm going to do now real quick is I'm going to put the fingerboard down on the neck, and it's just sitting there, and everything is looking really good. And here is a bridge that's just like the one that we're going to use. I haven't made our bridge yet, but this is one that's pretty much the same. And this plexiglass jig I've got here is made, these little brass pins up here are made to go in couple of holes that are in the saddle slot of the bridge. And I'm just going to set this jig right down so that we can see just where our bridge would go. So it's going to go right there. And now I'm just going to use the edge of this and get an idea of how our height looks. And let's see. The height is down here at the bridge is just under a 1/16 of an inch. It's a little over a 32nd of an inch over the top of the bridge. That's just about right. So right now, we want to get a basic idea of what the neck fit looks like. Right now, it's looking really good. So the only thing that we really need to do is, let me move the camera up here, set the guitar up like this. This joint right here on each side is pretty good, but it's not what I'd call quite perfect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and get a piece of sandpaper, and I'm going to pull that through a few times on each side just to be sure we get that joint just perfect. So here's a piece of sandpaper that I've got. This is just a piece, this is actually 80 grit. That's pretty rough. It doesn't have to be as rough as 80 grit, but 80 will work. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tip the neck up a little bit and get the sandpaper put right in between that neck and the body. And I'm going to just pull it. And I want to pull it as straight as I can. I don't want this end to be up high because then that'll create a problem down at the heel. I want to just make it as straight as I can. And I don't want to pull it all the way through. I'm trying to sand the whole edge. So I don't want to pull this all the way through. I want to stop before I get to the end of the sandpaper. So that's 2, here's 3 pulls. And I'll do 4 and 5. Okay, now I'm going to go to the other side and do the same exact thing. So if I sand one side too much, that'll start to turn the neck in one direction or the other, and so I don't want that. The neck is just dead straight right now, so I want to keep it that way. So I'm going to pull this one, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 times. And now let's take a look and see how the neck joint looks. That's actually looking really, really good on that side and really, really good on this side. So we're just about where we need to be. So the reason that I like to do this before I put on the fingerboard is because, let's just say, for example, that the neck was tilting up too high and I need to bring it down low. Then what I would do is I would take the sandpaper, oops, I just dropped it. I would take the sandpaper and just put it through partially. And then I would pull it all the way out. And what that does is that's going to sand the top edge here more than it sands the back edge, and that'll start to tip the neck forward. as long as I do both sides at the same time. Now, if it turns out that the neck is pointed one direction or the other, then, and it's not pointing up or down or anything, then I would do exactly what I just did before. I would just pull it on one side, not all the way through, several times, and then check the neck again for alignment, and that'll move it over left or right. So fortunately, we didn't have to do any of that. And our neck is looking really, really good. So at this point, we're pretty much ready to glue on the fingerboard. And there's a few steps that I want to take before we actually do that. And I'll go get ready for that, and we'll be back in just a few minutes. Okay, so one of the last things that I want to do before we glue on the fingerboard and before we glue in the carbon fiber rods and all that kind of stuff, I want to glue the ears onto the headstock. So let's take a look here. Here's the neck. Here's the headstock. This is all very thin. And here's the template that I'm going to be using for my headstock. You can see it's quite a bit wider than the headstock we have. And so like with a lot of guitars, we're going to glue a pair of ears, a couple of pieces of wood on each side of the headstock piece here. And I'll show you how I do that. So I'm just starting off on this bench here that's nice and flat. And I've laid a piece of wax paper over it. And it's going to take 5 clamps to clamp this whole thing down. And so the first clamp, I'm just going to use a little stick here, put it in the middle, and the first clamp just holds the headstock down hard against the bench. So let's put that on there. Okay, so that's done. Now here's the 2 pieces of wood that I've prepared for the ears, and they're just going to go here and here. And those all fit in there very nicely. These 2 sticks are just a pair of sticks that I want to put here and here, and I'm going to have a clamp on each one to hold the whole thing down hard against the bench. So the top of this headstock turns out to be as flat as we can possibly make it. So that's what those are there for. And then the last 2 clamps are going to go on to the sides here and clamp it together. So let me put glue on and let's see if we can get this thing going. Okay. So we just want to put a nice bead of glue right along that edge. I'm just going to set it in right here and do the next one. Okay, there we go. And now I'm going to put this stick here. Now I don't want to clamp these down really hard yet. I'm just going to give them a little bit of pressure to hold things down. But if you clamp it down too hard right now, then it won't clamp together very well. So we just want a little bit of downward force, and that'll be good enough for the moment. Okay, the next one here. Okay, and then the last two, they're going to clamp the whole thing together. And so I'm starting to see some glue squeeze out there, and these are going to get tightened down just a little bit more. Here and here. And tighten that one up a little more. And put this one down. And I'm getting good squeeze out. Push this guy down a little bit farther. And start squeezing this guy together. And this guy together a little more. So there we have it. Everything's looking good. I got squeeze out in the front edge here, all along the top, and everything looks good. So I'm going to leave that for at least a half hour, maybe 45 minutes or so. And I'll come back and then we'll flatten out that top. We'll have a little bit of glue squeeze out on it and stuff like that. And then we'll get ready to put on the, put in the carbon fiber rods and glue on the fingerboard. So we're making headway. So I'll see you after a little bit. Okay, so I took the headstock out of the clamps. Everything is looking great. It feels just perfectly flat. So before we go and do our next step, I'm just going to touch this on the belt sander just real quick. Make sure it's as smooth as it can be. It feels really good, but I want to get any excess glue off the top or anything like that, because one of the next steps, not the next step, but one of the upcoming steps is going to be we're going to glue on our headstock laminate. And I don't want to be gluing against glue, I want to be gluing against wood. So we're just going to sand this down. I'll show you how we do that real quick. And this isn't going to take much. So I'm not going to turn on the, the vacuum for this. I'm just going to kiss it real quick on the sander, and you'll get an idea of what's going on. That's all I'm going to do. This feels just as smooth as it can be. So we're going to go over to the next step. So the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to glue in my carbon fiber rod. So I'm going to go prepare a few things, and I'll be right back and we'll do that. Here's one of my carbon fiber rods here. This is a full 4-foot rod. I'm just going to put it into the slot here. Make sure it's just slightly over the length. And I'm just going to use a pencil. Now pencil doesn't show up real well on this, so you just got to mark it clearly. Then I'm just going to pull that over and mark again where the next length would go. So now I'm just going to move over to a different station, and I'm just going to saw these off. Okay, so you can see I've got the carbon fiber rod here, and it's put and tightened into one of my vices. And here's my line that I marked. So I'm just using a small saw. I'm just going to saw this off. And there it is. So I'll go cut the other one off. Come down to here. There they are. Now I'm going to go put them back on the neck, and I'm going to mark that angle, so I'll be right back. So I'm going to put this carbon fiber rod right into its slot, and I'm just going to use my pencil and mark this angle. And again, it doesn't show up real dark, but it does show up. So we'll do the same thing with the other side. Mark that angle. Okay, so the next thing is to go over to the disc sander and sand that angle off. I've got my line right there, and we're just going to sand that right off. That looks good. I'm going to go check it real quick, and I'll be right back. We're going to go do the second one now. I'll go check it. So as you can see, these both fit just perfectly. The end here is just fitting really nice. This end, one of them sticks out just a little bit. That's no big deal. We'll take care of that later. But I want to go get these glued in. So I'm going to get some epoxy and we'll go take care of it. I'll be right back. I'm going to put some tape here. I've got some paper underneath the neck. Epoxy is just messy stuff. So I'm going to put some tape down here to mix this on so that we don't get it everywhere. And then we can just tear off the tape and throw it away when we're done. Okay, so we're basically going to be filling up one of these slots. Oh, and I want to put some more tape on the fingerboard, so this is important here. I want to tape this area off really good, because I don't want this epoxy getting anywhere except in the slot where it's supposed to be. I'm going to cut this guy off here, and I'm going to just use the knife, and I'm just going to cut a slot right down the edge of the slot that's on the neck, both sides. And then I can pull that piece of tape out of the way. And cut it off down there. There we go. I had one little piece that was in the way. All right, so we're going to put our tape or our glue into that slot that we just created. So let's go and mix it up. Now this is 15-minute epoxy. So we've got a little bit of time, but not a whole lot. And this is not a high stress area either, so 15-minute epoxy is going to be just fine. So I like to put a line of epoxy down just about the same length as the slot that I'm filling. And then here's the other part. So I want to try to match that line as close as I can. This doesn't have to be perfect, but I want it to be as perfect as possible. There we go. Now I'm just going to use a wooden dowel that I've just kind of sharpened to a flat tip. And I'm going to mix this up. That should be pretty good. Now I want to just go and try to get some of this into our slot. It's not going to be, I'm not going to just fill up the slot, but I want to get a little bit of glue all the way along it. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. I've got a little bit of glue in the slot all the way up and down. So that looks good. So let's get our rod here. And I'm going to get one more thing. I'm going to get a screwdriver, because I like to be able to use the little stirring rod and a screwdriver to just stick this down into that slot as far as it'll go. You don't want it floating up. When you first put it in there, that's the first thing it wants to do, is kind of float up. So you want to get it stuck down really good. Okay, that looks pretty good. So now I'm going to get just a little bit more glue along my tip here and just wipe it all the way along the top. So I've got a bead of glue that goes all the way along the entire top. And that one is ready to go. Now we don't want to sit around and look for this glue to dry. We want to get rid of this as fast as we can. And there we are. We have one of them done, and that's just perfect. I can take this tape here and get it out of our way. I'm going to turn this around and we're ready to do it again. Now in my book, I used to stop the carbon fiber rod just short of the nut. And later I realized that I can use that thing all the way through under the nut and into the headstock. And it just gives me a stiffness that goes all the way through to almost to the end of the truss rod. So this is the way I've done it for quite a few years now. And I think this is much better way to go. Okay, so let's put this other piece on here. Okay. So there we have our slot ready. Let's go do it again. Okay. Okay, I think we're ready. It seems like I would have way too much glue here, but for some reason it never turns out to be that way. Okay, I think we've got it. Let's get this rod and put it in there. Okay. And there we have the second one. These look great. They're just going to sit there for a while. It may be 15-minute epoxy, but that doesn't mean that it's dry in 15 minutes. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to prepare our headstock overlay, and then we're going to get the fingerboard glued on. So we'll be back in just a little bit. We'll get the rest of that stuff taken care of. Okay, so right now I want to glue together our headstock laminate. And I've got some cutoffs from the sides, or from the back I guess it is, that I really like. I like the way this wood looks. I think it's going to be a beautiful headstock. But I don't know if you can see from the video there that there's a gap in the middle here. So I'm going to go over to the jointer and see if I can get that to go away. I'll be right back. So here's the piece. I brought it out of the jointer and it was pretty good. So I did the same thing that we did on the top and back. I rubbed it on a piece of sandpaper and it's just virtually perfect now. So I want to glue these together and we're just going to do it the same way that I've done a few other things on the videos. I'm going to clamp one side of it down. To my bench, I got some wax paper under it there. And the other side. Okay, then we're going to put a little bit of glue along one edge. That looks good. And there we go. And I'm going to put a couple of clamps here. One right there. And one right over here. And if you haven't guessed, I'm just going to slide a couple of wedges in here and get this stuff clamped down as well as we can do it. So you can see squeeze out coming from there. That's looking, actually this one needs to be turned around. There we go. I think that's all looking very good. We're going to leave that alone for 20-30 minutes and then come back and glue a couple more veneers to it so that we can put it onto the headstock. Here is our headstock laminate piece. I glued it all together and I just cut it down. I measured the headstock here. And it's approximately 3 5/8 by approximately 8. It doesn't have to be as long as 8, but I'm just going to do it that way for simplicity. So I just cut this piece out, leaving our center line right down the center. So I made it 3 5/8 by about 8 inches, and then I cut 2 veneers. One is maple, one is walnut. So I'm going to put the maple veneer right down on the headstock laminate. Actually, I'm going to put it on this side, and the walnut veneer will be on the outside. So when I glue these down from the side, you'll see the mahogany here, then walnut, then maple, then our top layer. So that'll just be a nice little addition there. So now I'm going to glue this up. And what I'm going to do is, I've just got my wax paper still here on the bench. I'm just going to put some glue on these 3 pieces. And get a caul, and I've got the wax paper to put over it. And I'm just going to glue it all down right here. And then let it sit for like overnight. You'll find that if you glue a sandwich together like this and you use Titebond, if you take it out of that sandwich in, I don't know, once the glue is pretty much dry, half hour, 45 minutes, it will warp and become a potato chip. So I'm going to keep this under clamping pressure for at least 24 hours, maybe more than that. And then we'll come back and use it for our headstock. So I'm just going to put some glue on here and glue this down. Now the thing that you have to watch out for with a glue up like this is it wants to swim. So we might have to mess around with it a little bit to keep it, keep the layers together without swimming too bad. So I'm just going to use this little card to smear my glue around. Make it as nice and even as I can. So that's pretty good. Then we put our maple piece down. And I'm just going to put more right over the maple. Is this coming out okay? Okay. Let me point that down a little more. There we go. Okay, there we have it. Now, I'm going to fold this piece of wax paper over our sandwich here. And then put the caul right over the top. Now I'm hoping that if I can look at this edge, I can see if it's swimming too much on me. And I'm going to use the F clamps again. So I'm going to try to put one right in the middle and start squeezing this down. And so far, everything's looking very good. It's not just taking off and swimming on me here. Okay, that's all looking pretty good. I can see some squeeze out through this side, and I would expect to see that. And it's looking good. So I'm going to let this sit, and we'll be back after a little while. While we've got that headstock laminate gluing up, we're going to come over and continue to work on the neck and see if we can't get this fingerboard ready to glue down. So here's my fingerboard right here. And I've just drawn a center line right down the middle. And I'm going to make a little mark right on the first fret, 1/4 of an inch off to one side, right there on the fret. And then I'm going to come up here to the 13th fret, and I'm going to mark a 1/4 inch on the other side, and we're going to drill a couple of holes. Okay, so here we are over at the drill press, and where I made those 2 marks, I've got a 1/16 inch bit in the drill press, and I'm just going to drill 2 little holes. And one more. Okay, so that's 1 hole right through the 1st fret, about a 1/4 inch off of center, and 1 hole through the 13th fret, a 1/4 inch off of center. Now we'll go back over to the neck and we'll line it up. Okay, so what I've done is I've brought the fingerboard over here. I've lined it up on the neck, got it centered on both sides, and I'm going to drill a hole. I took my 1/16 of an inch bit out of the drill press, and I'm going to drill a hole right into the neck, right through those 2 holes. And I don't want to go very deep. I've got my tape marking about a 1/2 inch, so that says that I go about a 1/2 inch through the fingerboard, or a 1/4 inch through the fingerboard and a 1/4 inch into the neck. And so these holes are not very deep, but they're deep enough to do the job. Okay. So now I've got some little brads that I use for this job, and these are perfect because they're almost exactly a 1/16 of an inch wide, and they just fit perfectly into my holes, and I get almost no movement. So that's just ideal. So that one's going in there. Fill it in. And I need to find my other one. There it is. And that's in there. Okay, so now I can take my clamps off and see that that's still in there very nicely with the brads. I'm going to put glue on this and glue it down, so I'll be back in just a minute. Okay, so we're ready to start mixing some epoxy up here. What I've got is System 3 general purpose epoxy. This is perfectly good stuff. It works well for this kind of thing. Now, one thing is a little different than what I usually do here, so let me explain this real quick. Usually, I have my truss rod slot a little bit deeper than I got it on this one. I don't know why it's not quite as deep as regular, but it's not, so that's okay. So instead of the truss rod being slightly submerged under the edge of the top edge of the fingerboard, it's dead level. That's okay. If it's submerged, I'll glue a little veneer over it to bring it up. This time we don't have to do anything, so it's just going to stay just the way it is. All right, so with the epoxy, I've got a couple little pipettes here that I can reach into the epoxy and suck some out. I clipped off the ends of the pipettes because this is pretty thick stuff. And if you leave the pipettes with real thin, fine tips, you just won't get much out. So I'm going to mix up, this is a 2-to-1 mix. So I'm going to mix up 0.2 ounces of the resin. And I'm just using a little jeweler's scale. As I understand, this doesn't have to be all this accurate, but I've got the scale, so I might as well make it as accurate as I can. 1.9, 195.2. Okay. So that is done. And I'm going to set this aside where it won't drip on my bench. And now let's do the other one. This is the hardener. Now this is the fast hardener. It's not that fast. Takes at least 2 to 3 hours to do anything at all. So I'm expecting that I'm not going to get back to this today, and I'm just going to leave it overnight and deal with it tomorrow or the day after, whenever it is I'm able to get back with it. So I'm going to 3 here, and there it is. That's good. Okay, so I've just got a little stick here. This isn't very much epoxy. I'm expecting that it'll be enough. If it's not, I'll mix up some more. This isn't drying anytime fast, so we've got plenty of time to deal with it. Okay, that should be good enough. I've got a foam brush if I need it. I don't know if I'm going to need it here. And I've also got a little card. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, wait a second. Almost forgot. What I want to do is put a piece of tape down, right down the middle. And what this is going to do, this is not going to perfectly keep glue off of the truss rod, because squeeze out is going to squeeze off to the side and go into the truss rod. But this will keep too much. I don't want a whole lot of glue slopping down into the truss rod slot. So just got a piece of tape there. That'll help to keep that from happening, and I'm just going to pour some glue out here. I think I've got plenty here. And so let's use the card. And I've got a lot of glue there. So that's all just fine. So now I'm going to put this brad back into this hole, and this brad back into this hole, and I'm going to take my piece of tape and get it off of there. And let's see if we can't get this down. There's the first brad in. Second one is in, and we're down. That's looking really good. So I'm going to wipe some of the epoxy that's kind of dribbled around here off, get it off of my hands. And now I'm just going to put these 1-inch spring clamps on the fingerboard, and that's going to do the job very, very well. I read about doing it this way in Bob Benedetto's book. So even if you're not doing an arch top, that book has a lot of good information to offer. So it's one that you should have. Another really good book is Bill Compiano's book. That's Guitar Making, Tradition, and Technology. Very, very good books. And I use them both all the time, in addition to my own. So you can see if you're going to glue your neck up like this, you do not want to carve the neck first. I like to leave the neck uncarved for a while. In fact, even the next step, which will be, well, we're going to glue on the headstock veneer, but then we're going to do our inlay. And I like being able to clamp the neck in a nice vise to hold it still when I'm doing my inlay work. And I can do that best if the neck is still square and not carved. So that's it. We are glued. So I'll wipe off a little bit of this, the dribbles that I've got. And now the next thing I'm going to do is get one of my glue cleanupper tools. I'll grab one real quick. Yeah, here's one right here. And we want to go all the way around this fingerboard and just clean up any squeeze out that we can. Way up here by the where the nut's going to be, there's some squeeze out. And then what I'll do is I'll take one clamp off, clean up the squeeze out right there, and then take this clamp and move it down and clean up the squeeze out. It's easier to do it this way than it is to try to put one in that narrow area. So this method works really well. And that's it. I'm going to turn the camera off. There isn't a whole lot of highly fascinating stuff going on anymore here. So I'm going to turn the camera off and we will get back together when everything is dry and we'll glue on the headstock veneer and we'll go from there. So thank you very much and I will see you later. Okay, well, it's been a couple of days since we got the laminate glued up for the headstock, and I've actually just been keeping it here clamped between two pieces of wood just to keep it flat. So here it is. It looks pretty good. What I want to do is take here's my headstock template that I'm going to use, and I'm just going to line it up with the center line as close as I can here. And I'm going to just take a white pencil and draw a couple of lines well outside where they need to be. And then I'm going to cut that area off. And you'll see why in just a minute, but let's go put this through the bandsaw real quick. I'll just move this camera over. And let's just cut this off. Okay, so now the reason that I like to do that is I want this edge here to be fairly short because I'm about to go over onto my my disc sander and sand an angle on that. In fact, it's the same angle as the angle of the headstock. So that front edge will go right up against the back of our nut. So I'm going to go and sand that real quick. There we go. We just got that edge sanded flat. Now, we may have to come back and do this again a few times. The reason is, if this was just a single piece of wood that we were using, the center line wouldn't be a real big deal. But we've got a book-matched piece here, so that center line has to go right down the middle of our headstock. if somehow this line isn't a perfect 90-degree angle and that center line is offline, I've got to come back, redo that edge just a little bit until the center line is lined right up. So anyway, I may have to go back and forth a few times, but this is a start and we'll keep going from here. So I'm going to move the camera again and we'll keep going. Now we're going to line this up on our headstock and see how our center line looks. If I push this all the way up against the neck or the fingerboard, and I've got the center line of the fingerboard lined up with the center line of this, and it comes down to this very end here. I don't know how well you can see it on the camera, but I'm off by maybe a little over 1/8 of an inch. So I've got to take this back over to the disc sander and push a little bit on this right side, come back and see if it lines up. So I'm going to go do that and I'll be back in a minute. That comes right to the center line there, right on the center line here. There's the nut. Everything's lining up just great. Now it's time to glue this thing in. So we're going to do that. I'm going to move this over to a vise and we'll take care of that. I've got to go cut a slot out so that I can put this plate down around the truss rod. So I've got to mark right around the center line, 1/4 inch wide, a slot that needs to go down probably 3/4 of an inch or something like that. So I'm going to do that on the bandsaw, and then we can get this thing down and get it fit. I'm just using this little ruler here, and I'm using the center scale part of the rule. It's a little ruler from StuMac, and I'm going to mark 1/8 of an inch on each side of my center line, and I'm going to come down, and this whole thing is going to be about 3/4 of an inch long. So I'll mark 3/4 of an inch and come down here and mark the other 1/8 of an inch on each side. And I'll draw this off. There. So let's turn on the saw and cut that out. Okay. So there it is. There's our slot. Now this, I cut inside the lines, and so I'm going to just use a little file and file it out to the lines so that I can then set it down on the headstock. Okay, so I've just got the headstock laminate sitting here. I've got this vise open a little bit, and I'm just going to use this nice straight file here and file each edge of my slot. And then I'll come over here and check to see if it's down. So there we are, that's down just fine. So there's the nut, and that goes in there. There's plenty of room, and everything looks very good. My line is nice and straight, the center line's good, everything's snug up here. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is get my headstock shape and show that to you. So here's the template. That's going to go on there just like that. So all I'm going to do now is I'm just going to drill a couple of holes. I just want to make a couple of holes that are out of my way, that aren't going to be a problem for anything. So I'm going to put one over here on this side, and I'm going to put one way up here in this corner. Okay, so I'm going to make sure that all of this is still on there good. Seems to be. I'm going to grab a couple of little clamps and just hold this down. Okay. Okay, so I've got a 1/8 of an inch drill bit in my drill, and I'm just going to drill 2 holes. And I'm going to put a little dowel inside those holes. And I want to cut those off. I'm going to use this little saw, and I'm going to cut it off a little bit high. And we'll put the other one in. Now, the holes that I drilled were 1/8 of an inch in both places. These dowels, I got them on Amazon. They are actually 3 millimeters. And so that's a few thousandths under 1/8 of an inch. So they slide into the holes fairly easily. They're snug, but they still slide in. If you try to put a 1/8 of an inch dowel in a 1/8 of an inch hole, it's probably not going to fit. And you'll have to sand it off a little bit. So this works really well. So that's all set. So now I'm ready to put on some glue and actually glue this thing down. So let's do that. And I can pull, the reason I leave these a little long is I can pull out the dowels with my pliers. And we can put on some glue. You want to get a nice even coating on here, as even as you can. Clearly using your finger is not going to be perfect, but it's going to be good enough. Okay, so let's get these put back in, there, and there. Let's see if we can find those holes. I'm going to push that back in there with my pliers. So that's good, both sides. Now I'm going to use this same little saw here and just saw off those dowel ends. So that's good. Now we just need to clamp it down. So I'm going to grab a couple of clamps and a board to put on here. Here's a great board. I've got a few clamps, probably way too many, but I don't care. And we'll get these put on. And there they are. Clamp down. The dowels are holding them in place so nothing's going to swim. And I've got just a little bit of squeeze out up there around the nut. So I'll use one of my little glue scraper tools and go up there and clean out the areas that need it. Okay, I think we're done. So I'm going to leave this on here for probably 45 minutes to an hour, and I'll be back after a little bit.